I'm very privileged now to begin the second half of our event, which will focus on the inaugural Summit for Democracy and launch our Democracy Playbook 2021, the Democracy Summit Edition. This document, which is available on the Brookings website. If you just Google Brookings Democracy Playbook, you'll find it, or look for it on our website. And we're going to give you other references to it. I really hope folks will take a look at it. We're launching it this week to help provide our humble suggestions on content for the Democracy Summit as the world's nations, civil society, and other stakeholders gather together this week, formally convening on Thursday and Friday to determine how to halt democratic backsliding and advance democracy all over the world. It's a really unique opportunity, including the year of action that will follow in 2022, leading up to the second convening of the summit. And our second edition of the Democracy Playbook is designed to help inform that critically important process with our 10 commitments. As I say, like the 10 commandments, the 10 commitments that we would like to see participants in the Democracy Summit make, whether government, civil society, or otherwise. And in our playbook, we lay those out, back them up by social science, longstanding practice, in order to help inform that year of action that lies ahead. Our panel is going to survey all three of the pillars of the Democracy Summit this week, and all of them are addressed in our Democracy Playbook. That is anti-corruption, which will be our main focus, but also activities to halt democratic backsliding and to protect human rights. Democratic backsliding, anti-corruption, human rights protection. Those are the three pillars, the focus of the Democracy Summit this week. But we will principally, but not exclusively, focus on anti-corruption. So I'm going to both introduce our distinguished panelists, which includes two of my co-authors and close colleagues from in and outside of government. But as I do that, I'm going to ask each of them a question. So let me begin by introducing Jennifer Lewis. She is the Deputy Director of the Anti-Corruption Task Force at USAID. Jennifer, what is the number one thing, specific and concrete, please, that you would like to see come out of the Democracy Summit this week?
Well, thank you so much, Norm. And I'd just like to start by noting how thrilled I'm to be joining you here today on this day of the release of our new U.S. anti-corruption strategy and the start for the Summit for Democracy. It's truly been a year unlike any other for those of us working on anti-corruption across the U.S. government. And I think it's worth underscoring at the top the priority that's been placed by this administration on anti-corruption and really what it means for us as a community. At USAID, we've long understood corruption as both a corrosive threat to democracy, as was mentioned earlier, but also truly as an enemy of development. And our administrator recently said, corruption is essentially development in reverse. And so I think one of the things in terms of our great hopes for the summit and my personal great hope for the summit is that in addition to witnessing countries take on bold new commitments to fighting corruption, such as the ones we just heard now from the Deputy Secretary on the US side, it's for us to walk away as a democracy community with a true understanding of the need to infuse anti-corruption across all of our work, whether it's on human rights, whether it's on electoral integrity. We simply cannot meet the ambition that we collectively have in defending democracy against multiple threats: rising authoritarianism, diminishing of human rights, and of course against other even more existential crises, such as addressing climate change, without tackling this fundamental issue. So concretely, I think there needs to be an understanding of the transnational nature of corruption, and therefore that it is a global problem that requires global solutions. For our part, we hope that we're walking away with a mutual understanding that to fight corruption, we cannot and should not go it alone. We need to start working with our global allies and partners, and we really see this summit as a clear starting point. And I just want to mention one other thing, that I really think it's important to not see this summit as a one-off event that we walk away with, one particular piece going forward. It's really the beginning of a process, and indeed a transformation, hopefully, of how we are defending democracy and countering corruption. The idea is to leave here on December 10th with a clear agenda for what we are calling the year of action between summits 1 and 2, and as well a clear commitment to supporting our partners in raising this collective ambition that's needed for the fight ahead.
Thank you, Jennifer. And speaking of that year of action, I'm going to turn to our next panelist, Dr. Alina Polyakova, one of our co-authors on our Democracy Playbook and the president and CEO of CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis, also a former and much loved Brookings colleague of ours, like the deputy secretary. Alina, what do you hope to see from the summit and year of action, and how does the Democracy Playbook inform your hopes?
Thanks so much, Norm. It's really wonderful to be back here with you again. Putting on a bit of my former Brookings hat and with the other colleagues on the conversation here. I wanted to pick up on what I think is a really important point that the Deputy Secretary made in an earlier discussion that speaks directly to what we were trying to urge the administration to think through when it comes to the future of global democracy. And that is the need to work across and with multilateral institutions, to engage our alliances, to really mobilize our allies in the democratic world around a core agenda, and to reinvigorate the U.S. broader interagency engagement. And I think having all of these different U.S. agencies represented in our conversation here, as well as earlier with the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, is just really important to send a signal that we're all on the same page and we're all in the same boat and we're all fighting for the same values and principles. And this is, of course, a core part of the Democracy Playbook. As you mentioned, Norm, the research that we conducted across so many different academic disciplines and social sciences to really understand what works and what matters. One of the takeaways has been that international institutions have a huge capacity to influence the trajectory of democracy still, despite the conversations we've had about the challenges around democracy promotion across the world. And of course, if we look across the Atlantic, we don't have to go very far to see some serious challenges to democratic governance in countries like Hungary, for example, which isn't part of the Democracy Summit, I think for very, very obvious reasons. So to my mind, the focus on what international institutions, agencies can do, what US agencies can do, like USAID, like the State Department, to work with our allies to build a cohesive and comprehensive strategy on everything from anti-corruption to supporting independent journalism, to working at the local level with democracy advocacy groups, with democracy activists, to ensure that what we are doing is reflecting the kinds of issues and problems that we're seeing emerge on the ground in some of these countries. And I think first and foremost, we need to really bring in all of our core allies and really understand what we can do at the level of the G7, the G20, and other multilateral and international engagements of that nature. I'm really excited to see what the year of action will lead to. The event this week is just part of the conversation. I think the Democracy Playbook basically provides what could be seen as a roadmap for where the year could go and how we can engage allies, and how we can get on the same page about what we can really do to invest in our common desire to see a world that is moving towards greater openness and greater freedom, not towards closed societies, which is, of course, something that many authoritarian states would like to see the world move in that direction.
Thank you, Alina. Ian Gary, my friend, the executive director of the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency Coalition, FACT. What do you make of the new anti-corruption strategy that the US government has launched today, the Deputy Secretary's remarks in that regard, and to what extent does that exemplify the kinds of specific concrete commitments that we've targeted in our playbook, and that are necessary to advance both anti-corruption, but also democracy? What's your view, Ian?
Thanks, Norm. I think my view is that Christmas came early for anti-corruption advocates in the FACT Coalition. And if we had
It's
put
just
together...
in time for the 8th night of Hanukkah. Not early, it's just in time.
Yeah, just in time. And if we had put together a wish list for anti-corruption Santa, so many of the things that we've been fighting for at the FACT Coalition for over a decade are on that anti-corruption strategy, and were highlighted by Deputy Secretary Adeyemo. So it's a really exciting day. We think the anti-corruption strategy is a very big deal. I think one of the things that is important about the remarks that were made just now by the Deputy Secretary is that there's a real recognition that the problems of illicit finance globally are in a large part, the US is in a large part responsible for some of those problems. And it's a recognition that we are a major offshore financial jurisdiction. As the Deputy Secretary mentioned, the ill-gotten gains from dictators and kleptocrats and criminals often wind up in places like Miami and South Dakota. So I think in terms of the strategy and his remarks, they were spot on. And I would hope to see within the summit later this week that the US continues to put forward a strong set of very concrete measures to address the gaps in our regulatory system, including around real estate, anonymous shell companies, and the private equity industry. And I think with that kind of approach and the multilateral action that Alina and Jennifer and others have indicated, we could make a huge dent in this scourge.
Thank you, Ian. And friends, if you want to look at our Democracy Playbook 2021 Democracy Summit Edition, which calls for many of the specific anti-corruption actions, plus a host of other pro-democracy commitments in detail. You can find that on the event page where you're watching this streaming. If you just scroll down, you'll find the link to the report. Michael Jarvis, you are the Executive Director of the Transparency and Accountability Initiative. I've worked in this field for many years. We work together, among other places, in our leveraging transparency to reduce corruption initiative that Brookings co-leads with Results for Development. My wonderful partners, Mario Picon and Robin Lewis, who helped manage that initiative, and we work together. Michael, I wonder if you could preview for us a little bit. I know you have a very important essay and op-ed coming out this week talking about some of these themes. Let me take you back to the summit that we're ramping up to. So privileged to have the first launch event in civil society on this Monday morning, but with the summit itself taking place on Thursday and Friday, what are the specific things you're looking for to come out of this convening and the year of action so that it's real, not just blah, blah, blah?
Thanks, Norm, and thanks to Brookings for organizing this and the Deputy Secretary. I mean, I think I can boil it down to ambition, to be honest. There was an interesting piece by the Financial Times columnist last week, Janan Ganesh, around is there a risk around this summit that by emphasizing a sense of crisis around democracy that we're actually playing into the hands of autocrats, that, you know, they want to have this narrative that they have the momentum. And I think one way to assuage those concerns is to lay out a set of steps, very concrete things that the participating countries are going to do that are concrete and ambitious. And I thought the Deputy Secretary, as Ian said, did a good job of setting a good stage and precedent for other countries to follow on this morning. I thought his framework worked well too. Like if you think about increasing enforcement, increasing transparency, deepening partnerships, you can think about what ambition looks like in each one of those. And increasing enforcement, like there's no shortage of existing commitments that have been made in other fora that countries just need to double down and enforce and put the resources behind. Increasing transparency, I would complement with thinking about increasing participation and agency and getting us towards accountability. But for that, to me, the year of action is a big opportunity. Like, we're not going to have the perfect set of things outlined at the end of this week, but we do have this year leading up to hopefully another summit where we can explore and figure out what are the next generation of commitments that we should be making. And if we can have a multi-stakeholder process to do that and learn from each other, and you know, there are still areas where the US needs to learn from other countries. It's great to see the advances on Corporate Transparency Act implementation, but that still is not public beneficial ownership information, for example. There are other countries joining the summit who have experience on that front. At the same time, they could be learning from the US on foreign bribery actions or the real estate innovations that were announced today. So, and that leaves me with the last point around the deepening partnerships, where I think working with the TEI sort of funder community, we're always looking at ways to reinforce multi-stakeholder action. And hopefully this year of action can be a place for that. And I'd be, you know, we support many civil society partners who've been fighting hard for a lot of the things that were outlined this morning in the speech from the Deputy Secretary, and hopefully fighting for a lot of the things that other countries will announce later this week. But, you know, commitments need time to be developed. They need to be, you know, you need to build infrastructure to enforce them properly. And perhaps that's where bilateral donors, and I'm looking at Jennifer and the work that we could do together with, say, USAID, and then our philanthropic funders that are part of the TI community as well, could partner together to support what those ideation processes look like and put some money behind implementation, so that 5 years from now, we're having a very different conversation from today.
This is it. This year is the moment. We've worked, all of us and so many other allies, for so many decades to get to this point. And so we appreciate that reflection. Michael, finally, last but far from least, my friend, a co-author of our report, Jonathan Katz, the Senior Fellow and Director of Democracy Initiatives at GMF, who helps lead the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, another co-sponsor, which I co-chair, working closely with John. You've heard what everyone else wants to see come out of the Democracy Summit, John, and you worked so hard to bring together today. I really thank you for that behind the scenes for so many months. How does our democracy playbook relate to what you've heard, John, from all of the prior panelists about their hopes and aspirations for for what we want to accomplish at the Democracy Summit this week, the world's democracies, government, civil societies, and other stakeholders, and the year of action, and then the reconvening ahead.
Yeah.
Bring us home on how the playbook relates to that, please.
Yeah, this was, first of all, thank you for having me participate, but also be part of this great group effort that I think is really well connected to the summit, the Democracy Playbook, which is a summit edition, but also to have the Deputy Secretary this morning really, I think, hit it out of the park on the Summit for Democracy Week. I think somebody mentioned Christmas, Hanukkah has come early for the anti-corruption community, but really, I think he set off set off this week in the right way. I call it sort of a giant leap forward in combating corruption. And I think what I heard from him is that there are going to be maybe more announcements throughout this week that are connected to the anti-corruption strategy, but also from Treasury Secretary Yellen, who I believe will be speaking at the summit as well. And of course, since it's a whole of government approach, which you spoke about, I'm sure that the USAID administrator, the Secretary of State, and others will be speaking directly, and other department and agencies will be speaking to this issue. But you asked about how this connects. I can't think of anything better when you write a playbook and a strategy, and one of your commitments, you can't actually just check the box yet on it, but one of our commitments was focused on strengthening this anti-corruption, strengthening these efforts. But I think with the summit and this playbook, how they intersect is really one, you point out this renewal effort to renew democracy, also a sense of optimism. And when I heard the Deputy Secretary speak today, it reminds me of all those that are engaged, democracy actors globally, governments, civil society, media, private sector, and others. And so our Summit for Democracy Playbook is instructive not only to renewing democracy on the anti-corruption effort and issue, but it lays out a number of different areas that are critical to advance and renew democracy, but also to promote human rights, which is a critical component of the summit as well. And I really think of it when I look at the playbook, and I'm listening to the administration and democracy advocates globally to talk about, sort of a four-pronged strategy, one of this development and resource needs that have been talked about, that we talk about in the playbook, that Jennifer spoke about. I hear bits and pieces with Michael and Alina, also in the Deputy Secretary's speech, the need to increase resources and funding for civil society, for independent media. When I think about the 0.3% of all development assistance that goes to independent media, I realize, that it's just not adequate. So when you look at issues like funding and resources, you look at that type of support that the United States has been providing, but can certainly be doing more, and our partners as well. The other part is the internal resources, which I heard the Deputy Secretary loud and clear, that if you want to enforce, tax enforcement, or you want, parts of the U.S. government to be able to carry out these activities globally, or other countries as well, which was said too, they need the infrastructure and funding. Then we need the diplomacy, which is happening this week at the summit, the year of action, the summit next year. Hopefully there'll be a summit in perpetuity every year that will see democracies globally step up to pick up the ball from this administration so that we continue to have this. And in our summit playbook, Playbook for Democracy, we talk about the importance of strengthening these international institutions and their capacities and capabilities. Not only are we looking at the UN system, but looking at regional bodies like ECOWAS, or looking across the globe where democracy can be fought for, where we can address things like anti-corruption issues or support for civil society and human rights. So we have development, diplomacy, and then defense. You couldn't start off better than with General Allen, but what he pointed out was defense isn't always about use of military. It's about creating those ecosystems that prevent these bad things from happening, and investment in those We play a lot of defense globally in the need to address these challenges, but that has to be part of this effort, is the defense of democracy, defense when we see malign actors, including in the United States, or leaders in the United States that are doing things that undermine democracy. And I think there is no greater challenge we can see than right here at home in the United States to defending democracy and what that means, what a difference it makes between last year then and where we are today to have a summit like this. And I think we shouldn't forget how important that is. And then last, I would just say, going on the offense. And I felt listening to the Deputy Secretary, and looking at our playbook, it's as much about going on the offense as it is playing defense, which is taking these steps, making these declarations, putting the resources in. And I see this every day, not only at, from our see it at US Treasury, but USAID and others working every day, going on the offensive, figuring out ways, not only to play defense, but getting ahead. And I think this is incredibly important. When we look at the summit playbook, it's about going on the offensive, it's about defense, diplomacy, and then also development of resources.
Thank you, John. So I'm going to ask all the panelists to unmute, or at least to have their unmute button at the ready. And we're going to do the second best part of the panel, which is the free-for-all. I have a couple questions for the entire panel. And then I have dozens and dozens of amazing questions that have poured in from our very stimulated viewing audience, which is marvelous. My first question to the panel is, we've addressed the anti-corruption pillar of the summit at length, and anti-corruption is one of the areas of the 10 commitments in our democracy playbook, and one of the 3 pillars of the summit. But we've assumed the importance of anti-corruption as part of democracy. Can I ask all of you to unpack a little bit, and I'll play devil's advocate. Okay, fighting democratic backsliding, I get that. That should be part of a democracy summit. And human rights have been strongly identified with democracy from the very beginning, from ancient Athens. But anti-corruption, of all the pillars, why make anti-corruption a focus, and why are we hitting it so hard today? Panelists?
I can start, Norm, from a civil society perspective and taking Europe as an example here. I think the clear answer to that, from what we've seen in terms of how democratic backsliding begins in democracies, is that corruption is at the heart of this. It is how disinformation, state-sponsored disinformation attacks are financed. It is how media freedoms are repressed by, for example, illicit sources going.
Let me stop you, Lena. What's the disinformation connection?
Yeah, of course.
With anti-corruption and democracy.
Well, we've seen over and over again in many, many countries where we've seen a reversal of democratic governance is a desire to clamp down on independent media. So public resources that are illicitly acquired then go into the pockets of those close to the regime that then basically sponsors or completely buys outright media outlets that then spread misleading narratives about democracy, spread misleading narratives about public health issues. We've seen this very, very clearly in the COVID-19 era. And then really the model for this has been Moscow and Russia, and the way that the Kremlin regime has used illicit finance to push through and deploy very, very damaging anti-democratic narratives, and also to sponsor all kinds of different proxy groups, troll farms. We may remember one of those troll farms from the 2016 elections. How was that funded? Through illicit finance and corruption.
Okay. Michael, go for it.
Yeah, well, so my home country is the UK, and I was just reading the papers this weekend, and there was a survey that's come out that shows that public perceptions of politicians are that 63% now believe they're only in politics for themselves, and only 5% believe they're in it for the public good. And a lot of that, when they dug deeper, reflected people's reactions to a stream of scandals that really relate to corruption. Some of those are related to the pandemic, these chumocracy deals where, you know, those who were politically connected got access to procurement deals ahead of others. So you're seeing a direct tie between perceptions of corruption, realities of corruption, and trust in government. And that undermines faith in the democratic process as well. You're going to be more amenable to, you know, some of those disinformation risks that Alina just highlighted if your perception is that, you know, your existing system and those who are representing it are only in it for themselves. So I think we need to have strong rules, crack down on corruption, and that in turn has the reinforcing sort of positive health effects on the democratic system as a whole. And, you know, it starts at home. And that, you know, yes, we need to be clamping down on these loopholes and ways of illicit money coming in that only take advantage of those things. But there are some basic things as outlined in your playbook that we need to pick up from the start.
If I could jump
And
in.
remember, friends, yes, go ahead, Ian. I was just going to say, remember, friends, you can look at the playbook on the event website where you're streaming this. There's a link, or simply Google Brookings Democracy Playbook. Although the Democracy Playbook is the child of all of the different institutions who co-authored it. All right, Ian, I think you were going to jump in.
Yes, and just to add to Alina and Michael, I think the connections are very clear when you think about kleptocracy as not the rule of an individual, but a systematic rule that includes both systems of corruption and patronage within the country concerned, but flows of illicit finance around the world. And, you know, paradoxically, corrupt leaders want to find rule of law institutions and rule of law countries as safe havens to park their ill-gotten gains. And that's why you see, you know, Russian oligarchs are buying, you know, British Premier League soccer teams and real estate in Miami, because they know that we have strong rule of law institutions, and they're not, they're afraid that if they keep their money at home, it's insecure. And so I think we have to think, as Casey Michel has said in his recent book about American kleptocracy, as kleptocracy is a global system, and the US is participating in it as long as we have all of these gaping loopholes related to, say, real estate or private investment funds that Deputy Secretary outlined.
I was so glad to hear the Deputy Secretary talk about jurisdictions like South Dakota and Delaware because of the perversity of the attraction, the magnetism for kleptocrats of the United States on the one hand, or other rule of law, strong rule of law systems. On the one hand, they seek the protections that our democratic systems provide. On the other hand, we have some gaping loopholes that make those protections even more attractive, where you have states that have this extreme secrecy that I think Jennifer, the new strategy that the United States government is implementing is really going to target. Before I move to my next question, I did want to point out, Alina, on your point about subverting a free and independent press and turning it, as we've seen in Turkey with Erdogan, in Hungary with Orban, turning the press in using corruption to turn alleged corruption to turn the press into an instrumentality of anti-democratic forces. John, you've done some very interesting work at GMF, and it's a model partnership because you've done this with the Slovak government and with our wonderful new ambassador to the United States of Slovakia, Radovan Javorčík, in boosting independent media. So before we go, and Jennifer, I'm going to come to you first on the next question. But before we do that, John, do you just want to reflect any further on Alina's point about the critical importance of an independent, free media and individual journalists to making the whole virtuous cycle of democracy work?
Absolutely, and I think what you point to in terms, I just wanted to highlight Slovakia, but other countries that have really stepped up to provide leadership, and of course, journalism, investigative journalism, free media is under assault in a number of spaces. We have challenges in the United States as well, including in the previous administration in particular. And so I think we've looked very hard at what the needs are for independent media and the importance. And I do think this is one area where I hope we spell it out in the playbook. But also, I think I'm hearing, hopefully from the administration as well, that this is a key area where the U.S. will be pushing hard because there's an understanding about the devastating impact of disinformation. We've seen it during COVID-19. Which has been particularly acute and problematic, including in the United States as well. And so with the Slovak government, we looked hard at how do you support, for example, investigative journalists who are on the front lines of democracy reporting on corruption. And it was also mentioned by the Deputy Secretary, the importance of this ecosystem of civil society, of investigative journalists, of law enforcement and government and all these different pieces to challenge corrupt actors. And your question was about authoritarians. And when trust in democracy is critical, authoritarians are trying to undermine that trust over and over again because they don't have free and fair elections in countries like Russia. So they're not playing to that playbook. So corruption is this calling card of authoritarians. And of course, when you have investigative journalists, those like Mr. Navalny exposing Mr. Putin and his corruption, they're usually targeted. And so authoritarians are directly connected to the worst human rights abusers globally. They're the most corrupt actors globally. And the ecosystems around them in their countries also mirror that unless it's changed. So if you want good governance, if you want free and independent media, those resources have to be put into this. And I do want to thank the Slovak government because and others that are looking at how best to increase their support because it is a key component of addressing both authoritarians and corruption and protecting human rights globally.
Jennifer, I'm going to come to you for the next question, and then we're going to throw it open to the panel. Moving beyond the anti-corruption pillar alone, can you explain why, from the USAID perspective and from the State Department perspective, and from your perspective as someone who has long worked in this area, anti-corruption interfaces with the human rights pillar of the Democracy Summit?
Sure, thanks a lot. Well, I think this really relates to the question you had previously, and you challenged us to think about why anti-corruption should sit in a Democracy Summit. And I would argue that corruption is an existential threat to democracy. A lot of these have been laid out by the previous panelists in terms of the links to autocracy, kleptocracy, right? The links to globalized corruption trends. But I'll just take it from a development angle. We're a development agency, and this is our bread and butter. This is what we see all day, all around the world, the way in which corruption fundamentally undermines development progress across all sectors. And that's the case whether it's in health or education or economic growth or in our outcomes in biodiversity. And this is something that the Deputy Secretary just emphasized as well in his remarks. Indeed, when you really dig into these issues, you see that corruption is at the root of almost every development ill. It's really the anti-development strategy, something that's always been the case. And this is not new, this is not news to anyone. Corruption is a problem as old as time, but the fundamental shift that we have seen in this last decade is one that has really transformed corruption from a community-based or country-based program, a pervasive, systemic nuisance, really, to one of epic importance for democracy. And that has everything to do with both the increased scope and scale of corruption, right? We talked about this on this panel, the scope of corruption morphing really into a global phenomena beyond the purview of individual countries, related to kleptocracy and organized crime and strategic corruption. And all of this really relies on weaknesses at the country level in the oversight and regulatory processes, as well as the gaps in the global financial system that have been referenced by the Deputy Secretary. Corrupt actors are exploiting these weaknesses to pilfer public resources that should be available for development, and to launder and then hide the proceeds of their graft. We've talked about how these proceeds end up in destination countries, but we also need to really underscore what was mentioned also by the Deputy Secretary, which is the effect on communities and countries in terms of the diversion of these life-saving and other public resources. We've seen the scale of corruption increase as corrupt actors are able to access some of these international networks of illicit financing crime, but also the networks of exploitation that really damage marginalized communities. And I'll just say, you mentioned ancient Greece, perhaps not, but in 1776, John Adams wrote that government is instituted for the common good, for the protection, safety, prosperity, and happiness of the people, not for the profit, honor, or private interest of any one man, family, or class of men. So you have it right there from one of the founding fathers. Government is meant to serve the people, not to take from them. And so that's why this is at this summit. We cannot address these other issues without addressing this fundamental tenet of accountability to the people. So turning to your human rights question in particular, I think it's been pretty clear with some of the statistics that were mentioned earlier, the corruption of institutions that are created to defend human rights, that were specifically created to defend, including, for example, the justice system. This has a corrosive impact on individuals and their around the world. And of course, it always heaviest on the marginalized and the most vulnerable. Transparency International, for example, estimated 8% of people across 15 countries in Asia paid for public health services such as healthcare. In the water and sanitation sector, the World Bank has estimated that corruption depletes between 20 and 40% of access to water investments, which of course has severe impacts on the poor. And then of course, corruption itself funds labor and human rights violations, as well as trafficking of wildlife and arms and drugs and people. And so this is really the way in which these themes are interwoven, a very purposeful weaving together of themes. And I do want to mention, though, that while it's important to recognize the connections between the problem sets that the summit is seeking to address, it's also worth mentioning that both the commitments and the actions that we need to take these pillars, to address the problems in these pillars are also connected and interlinked. And some of them were mentioned earlier, whether it's, looking at this from an ecosystem perspective, making sure that we are strengthening government capacity while also enhancing and empowering civil society and media actors to serve as watchdogs and to detect and expose corruption and human rights violations and authoritarianism. These are all really connected. We basically need countries to take bold new actions to disrupt the status quo in these three areas and to dismantle the systems that support them. And at the end of the day, we need to emerge from this with broader coalitions and networks of our own, which is why I'll underscore that I think one of our hopes is this idea that these are not separate buckets, but very interrelated, whether you're talking about disinformation or going after anti-corruption or human rights activists and imperiling them for speaking truth to power. This is something we need to come together with to get together on as a community.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. That was a powerful answer, and it also tied together the three pillars. So, so with that, I'm now we've been balancing the time between our panelists, and we have about 10 minutes left in the seminar. So what I'm going to do now is go to the audience questions, and I'm going to ask the panelists, please, because I want to take as many audience questions as I can. So I'm going to ask you to be very disciplined as you answer. Ian, this one is for you from Sujata Holman, who's a physician. How can we prevent corruption from getting in the way of appropriate and just allocation of infrastructure money? This is something that is of hot importance in the United States at the moment, but globally too, as we recover from the pandemic. Of appropriate and just allocation of infrastructure money on a state and local level.
Thanks, Norm. I think one of the important aspects to this question is looking at how the international donors have responded to the coronavirus pandemic, as well as how multilateral donors like the World Bank and IMF have responded. And if you look at some of the IMF emergency loans to developing countries that have high governance and anti-corruption risks, they have asked for information, for example, on beneficial owners of companies that are getting procurement contracts. They've asked for auditing, but we're still seeing corruption in the infrastructure sector and in the procurements related to COVID. And I think we need stronger and more mandatory requirements attached to international funding for infrastructure and pandemic response. So that would be one of my short answers.
Yes or no, the new US anti-corruption strategy that we've announced today, will it help? It's integrated domestic and international strategy. Will it help on this infrastructure corruption front?
It certainly has to help. I mean, in terms of corruption risks.
Well, it's a yes or no question. I'll take yes for an answer.
Is top of the list.
Okay, the next question is from Ricardo Spraglin of US ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He's a chaplain program administrator there. Do we truly recognize the insidiousness of this issue of anti-corruption? Jennifer, do you think this is something that is truly recognized in the United States and globally?
I think it's truly recognized across the US government. And I think it's something that folks in the US government working on these issues have known for a long time. We're seeing it today with the release of our strategy, this unequivocal statement that this is a national security imperative and that it is corrosive to all of our democratic institutions and processes. You heard it from the Deputy Secretary earlier. It's also corrosive to our financial system and therefore the futures of average Americans around the country. And so I think there is an absolute moment and a recognition. I don't know whether the question was going to the general American public, but I think that's part of our task as a government and as an anti-corruption community, is to socialize this issue, to really make people understand why it should matter to them and why they should fight for it.
And as a panel, that's why we're doing what we're doing today. And that's why we put the playbook out there. Michael Jarvis, you are a transparency expert, and Sophia Yan of NYU Law Tax Law Center, where she's an attorney advisor, wants to know, what role should transparency around tax reporting play in anti-corruption policy?
A great deal. I mean, this has been a long sought after demand for good reason. Like if we understand who's paying taxes in each jurisdiction, we're able to minimize tax avoidance and tax evasion. And we're also able to see where these flows of money are, and it links to the beneficial ownership transparency we've been talking about, the procurement transparency. As you build these up, you really close off the different ways that these webs of illicit finance flow. And it gets to this core point about fairness and showing like faith in democracy also, I think, reflects fairness in the sense of how the system works and who's gaining from it and who's gaming it. So again, tax transparency is a key angle there. But I also just wanted to add a point on the last question is, we have to be aware that we're not the only ones who claim an anti-corruption narrative. China is very strong on anti-corruption, but it's highly politically controlled and motivated. So we need to emphasize the human rights and the anti-authoritarian dimensions alongside it, because the package together is the differentiator. We're not the only ones who sort of claim cracking down on a corruption as a way to sort of win public favor.
Alina Polyakova, we talked about the following issue, which Judge Vanessa Ruiz, the immediate past president of the International Association of Women Judges and a judge on the District of Columbia's highest court, the DC Court of Appeals, asks, how do you view the rule of law and an independent judiciary? We had a lot of back and forth on this in the report, including comments from experts. As part of the anti-corruption agenda, how do you view that, Alina, and how do we address it in the Democracy Playbook?
Well, Norm, as you said, this was a big part of our work on the Democracy Playbook to really outline, especially how democratically elected leaders start to push back in a creep kind of way, very small steps and incursions against judicial independence. And over time, what that, of course, leads to is setbacks in the rule of law when our judiciary systems no longer act as a check on the executive, as a check on other powers that be. And we see this happening as part of this sort of autocrats playbook across the world over and over again, together with some of the other issues we've been talking about. And again, I think corruption fuels all of this. In many countries, unfortunately, the price for a judge is known almost as public information. And this is exactly why illicit financial flows and having a real conversation, raising greater awareness about corruption is so key when it comes to rule of law in particular. Because when we start to lose transparency and trust in the judicial process, this is where I think we hit real problems when it comes to democratic governance more broadly.
Thank you. Thank you, Alina. And finally, John Katz, I'm going to ask you, because we're almost out of time, just for a 30-second answer. It's one of the most important questions we got from Bob Jundeff, the chair of the Social Security Advisory Board. Can foreign nations and foreign cultures be affected by US policy? And I'm going to make a friendly amendment, when the US has had so many struggles. Short answer, John.
Yeah, United States has long been a leader in support of democracy. We're the world's oldest democracy. And I think the Summit for Democracy, what you're seeing in the playbook, outline how the US renews democracy globally. Deputy Secretary Adeyemo pointed out that this has to happen with partners globally, with civil society, private sector, with others. And the United States isn't coming into this and has been very clear that the challenges are at home, they're domestic, and they're international. And so I think the US is credible at presenting these next steps at the summit as we lay out in the playbook. But I don't think the US is coming at this from a position saying that we don't have our own struggles and challenges. The goal here is to address both of them at the same time, both at home and abroad. And I think that's what the administration is really set out to do. And we heard from the Deputy Secretary steps that impact the United States domestically, but also will impact both partners abroad and the ability to address authoritarians, corruption, and protect human rights.
I want to thank all of my panelists, the Deputy Secretary, John Allen, Brookings, all of the sponsoring organizations, all of the co-authors of the Democracy Playbook. You can find the link to the playbook right here on the event page or by Googling Brookings Democracy Playbook. What a great launch to the week of the Democracy Summit and to this critical period in fighting anti-corruption, but also its relationship to promoting human rights and reversing democratic backsliding. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll be back with you during this year of action as we hold the world's democracies' feet to the fire to make sure they make and live up to their commitments as we've laid out our recommendations in the Democracy Playbook 2021 Democracy Summit Edition. Thanks, everyone. Great having you with us. Thanks, guys. You were incredible. We packed a lot in.
Thanks, Norm.
Thank you, Norm.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.